This podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not intended to provide medical advice. It exists only to entertain. This episode is brought to you by our sponsor and favorite healthcare worker and anatomy-themed apparel and design company, Artery Inc. Presently, they are featuring a collection of shirts, stickers, and other designs for Mental Health Awareness Month. Lots of really cool designs this month featuring brain-heavy imagery in their own particular artistic style. Go over to www.arteryinc.com, that's INK, and use the code LISTENTOPHP to save 10% on all orders over $35. Doing so saves you some money and shows your support for our show. Note the code does not apply to the subscription boxes, however. All right, let's get to the show.
Throughout history, this is Max and Mary, Mike and me. You gotta listen, you don't have to read. For historians, for historians, for historians.
Welcome, everyone. This is For Historians, a podcast delving into the archives of medical history. As three emergency physicians, we will explore the unusual ailments, treatments, physicians, and all related material having to do with the healing arts. I'm Max, and I'm joined here by my good friends and colleagues. Well, just Mike. Hi, Mike.
Hi.
You know where Aaron is?
He's at work.
Is he at work? Why isn't he here for the recording?
I don't know. Because he's bad at scheduling.
Yeah, he's bad at reading his own schedule. He agrees to recordings in advance, and he's like, oh, I got to work.
Yeah, 5 to 1. I should be able to do 7.
Well, you know what? I guess if Aaron can't be here, we should find somebody else to fill his shoes. And you know what? Turns out we did. So that being said, I would like to welcome Patrick Kelly back to the show, returning guest. And you may remember him from his excellent work all the way back in episode 33, which was centered on the history of anaphylaxis and the development of the EpiPen. He's coming back triumphantly to the Poor Historian studio to basically do our homework for us, and it is much appreciated. Patrick, welcome back.
What's up, gentlemen?
Hey, Patrick.
Oh, yeah, just drinking some tea late in the evening because that's how I roll sometimes.
I'm stoked we made it work. Late day for everybody.
Indeed. So we, our listeners, if they remember that episode, may remember you from your YouTube channel and all the teaching you do on there in anatomy, physiology. You do have a master's degree in exercise physiology, if I do recall. And what have you been up to lately? What's been going on there?
Making lots of videos, less on the anatomy and physiology side these days, and actually more into the medical history stuff. I've just been having so much fun with it. And honestly, you guys have been a big inspiration for that.
Oh, no.
I see that you guys are constantly pumping out good stuff, and like it has become one of the highlights of my week, or every other week.
Oh, well.
When you guys make something.
I really do appreciate that. No, it's frightening to inspire people, actually. I don't, Mike, have you ever inspired anybody?
Well, it's easy, yeah, because I do all the work with the podcast. You guys just show up. But...
No, but excellent. Well, obviously, we're going to direct our listeners to go over and check out your channel. We'll have those links, but you can find them at, if you haven't mentioned it already, at Pat Kelly Teaches over there on YouTube. And I can definitely attest to the fact that these videos are extremely well researched, way better research than any episode of our show is. So we might as well outsource that to people who are capable of doing so. So
I tell you, YouTube is more than just cat videos.
Well, that's. I watch a lot of cat videos, though.
You would, Max.
Well, last time you were here, Patrick, we did not have the new segment, and the new segment being Mike's Mailbag, where a listener can send in a question and try to stump Mike. Basically, they have to ask Mike a question or fact in medical history and see if Mike knows the answer without Mike knowing what the question is. And what is your record right now, Mike?
I'm 0-3.
So he's doing excellently. And then, here's the good thing. If you, as a listener, are able to stump Mike or he doesn't know the answer, you get to have a medical eponym named after you. So your name goes down in the annals of medicine. So let's see. We have a listener question here from Patrick K.
Hey.
Interesting. Patrick writes, what medication discovered in 1911 was considered to be the first antimicrobial? Mike's leaning back.
It was...
I would have thought
I
you'd have a
thought-
really quick snap answer for this.
Well, no,
but you seem
it's-
suspicious.
No, I think I'm jumbling words because it's boron. It's one of the heavy metals. I think the atomic number is it must be 7 or 8. So boron, when halogenated, can be antimicrobial. I was thinking borax. I was confusing with borax because they were using
It
borax
absolutely happens.
to clean their clothes. And then somebody was like, hey, can you hand me the borax? And they handed them the boron inadvertently and found that person then was free of bacteria.
Okay. Here's the thing. You're definitely wrong, but you're almost right. You're actually closer to being right than I'm comfortable with, to be honest. So, Mike, the actual answer here is a medication I don't think we've prescribed ever, and maybe you have. I don't know. You've been practicing longer than I have. But salvarsan. Salvarsan.
Yes.
So this was actually, the initial compound was discovered in 1907, but it was discovered to be antimicrobial in 1911. And so it predates penicillin by 3 decades or so there. It's an arsenical compound. So it has arsenic in it.
So I got a
that's
heavy
where
metal.
that's where you dipped pretty close. But did you call boron, isn't boron a heavy metal?
It's a heavy metal,
It is?
technically,
Okay,
I think,
all right.
because it's
Yeah.
right under carbon, isn't it? And I probably was wrong with the atomic number.
I'll
Look
I think
it up.
6, whatever. No. Anyway.
No, 6 is carbon.
All right. Well,
Max.
I think it's been a long time since my general chemistry. Patrick Kelly is squinting a lot right now. He's just
A little
he looks
bit.
very
Oh, it's number
excited by this.
5. Boron's
Oh.
You say my
5.
chemistry is weak. What is 6? Nitrogen?
Anywho, so it was actually discovered to be antimicrobial because it was a treatment for syphilis. So it does kill Treponema pallidum, the bacteria that causes syphilis. And the distinction here, and the reason that it predates technically is the first antimicrobial, is that its antibiotics are specific to bacteria. This not only kills Treponema, or the syphilis bacterium, but it also was used on trypanosomiasis, a parasitic infection, which is kind of a different organism. So therefore, it's antimicrobial. It can kill many different microbial forms of life, as opposed to penicillin, which is just good at killing the bacteria. So, you know what? You don't get partial credit, but you get a nod to almost getting partial credit.
All
How's
right,
that?
cool. Yeah.
All right.
I'll
Well,
take
that means our listener Patrick K gets
Ooh.
gets an eponym named after him, and so we have Patrick's postulate, which is the fact. You may not have heard of this, but it basically what it says is that any concept in anatomy or physiology cannot be fully understood if it is not able to be presented in a concise fashion on YouTube. So that is a thing. If you cannot make it into a YouTube video, you cannot truly know it. So that is Patrick's postulate.
I'll take it.
I like it.
Oh wait, this was you, Patrick?
Yeah, sneaky.
Oh,
I thought, no, this is
geez,
going to be too easy. This is going to be Mike's first win.
This is
Our break his streak.
This is our first true nepotism mailbags. So I'm sorry, Mike. We conspired against you.
No, it's okay. I'm just I'm stoked that it got so close.
There was one other one that you got pretty close on. So that was I actually am I have to try to hide them from him, Patrick, so that he doesn't find them. So I have a whole system in place.
And it's funny, I just looked up boron, and boron it's borax. It's the same thing.
Okay, we're connecting the threads together.
Yeah, right. It's all about connecting threads.
Speaking of connecting threads and segments together, or kind of, Patrick Kelly is here to discuss something. So what did you bring us today? What are we talking about in our main segment?
Sure. Well, today we're going to be talking about the old and international rivalry between Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch.
Oh, good rivalry in medicine. Did they joust back and forth in the journals?
Verbally, yes. We're going to learn more about that too. They had some choice quotes for each other.
Ooh, was there ever a fist fight?
As far as I know, no.
No.
But Koch was also 20 years younger than Pasteur, so I think he might have had the advantage.
Okay,
I'm
fair.
gonna pasteurize your ass.
That's
You
good.
could say
Well,
that. He could be the first person who said that.
Ass?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I don't have a document.
Uh-huh. Oh, I should
was a
send
good
that to you.
I don't need it.
Okay, fair enough.
That's
All
good.
right, well, let's get into it.
Well, let's get into this. The reason that this is such an important story is because their rivalry was such a big deal in the formation of germ theory. So before we get into the proper story, we should probably define what germ theory is. Do you guys want to take a guess at, I think we throw it around a lot. We say before germ theory, after germ theory. Do you have a good working definition of what germ theory is?
My understanding is that germ theory is the understanding of how a disease or disease state can be transmitted between person or environment by way of a microbial agent, and that you can then retroactively prove that the microbial agent was the causative factor of the illness by replicating that transfer in an experiment.
Yeah, you're getting into the how we know one particular germ is the cause of one particular disease, and that's going to be important later on. We're going to define germ theory from the beginning as just infectious disease comes from a pathogen. It seems like super simple, but this is the overarching
I like
idea.
that one better, that explanation. Max is
Yeah,
sounding
nice
like
and
an
concise.
attorney.
I started postulating, that's why.
Heyo. But it's a super important idea, right? Like, we have modern medicine based on this idea of germ theory. Like, everything, antibiotics, like vaccines, comes from this idea of germ theory. And these two that really get notoriety for advancing germ theory, Louis Pasteur from France and Robert Koch from Germany.
Oh, you wrote Lewis.
Yeah, well, you know what? There's going to be a lot of dropped final consonants from some of these French names.
Okay.
Do you guys speak any other languages? Do you speak French? Do you speak German?
Mike speaks a little Italian.
Just enough to get by.
It's terrible. It's so good, but it's terrible.
I
get
No, I sadly do not. I did learn some Italian in high school, but I never really could apply it, so I forgot it all.
That is fine. I guess on the we should spoil it now. We are not going to pronounce Koch correctly. There's that ending like sound, the throaty sound of the H, and we're American. It's going to be hard to do it. So apologize. We're going to say Coke. It is what it is.
That's going to make me more comfortable. Yeah, I've tried. I did try. I listened to the pronunciation, and it sounds cool.
Is
I
it
don't think
like caw? Coca.
Yes.
Yeah.
we're
Yes,
going
that's
with
it.
Coke.
Yeah. So the reason I'm presenting you this story is because for the last couple months, I've been working on this video of the history of germ theory. And while I knew these two were around at the same time, I didn't really know how much their rivalry advanced germ theory, as opposed to each one doing their own thing by themselves. So today we're going to do a little bit of background on each of them. I don't want to go like deep dive into their careers, but like just enough so that we're familiar with what's going on. How their first little public smackdown went, and then how their legacies became rivalries of their own. Sound good?
That sounds like a good episode. We should do that.
Fantastic. All right, let's go. So their beef really starts in the 1870s, and it revolves around the discovery of anthrax. But we got to do some character development first.
I don't want to correct you on the air, but anthrax wasn't founded until 1981.
Oh God.
I don't think
You know what?
Scotty Ian
You
was
know
that
what?
old.
Poor
That's
Pat.
not
He's just gonna
terrible.
be like, we're done.
That's not bad, because like anthrax, the germ, they have been around and dormant and still stayed alive.
That's true.
Yeah.
The band
So, not
actually
a terrible
forms
comparison.
biofilms and can exist in the environment for long periods of time.
we're getting ahead of ourselves. All right, let's talk about Pasteur. So we're gonna start in the 70s. By 1870, Pasteur was already a well-known scientist. He was the leading scientist in this new field that was forming of bacteriology. But he actually got his start as a chemist, and first got popular because he discovered this property called chirality. This is where molecules have handedness, or like mirror opposite versions of themselves. You might remember this from chemistry.
Oh yes, I remember drawing all the diagrams in organic chemistry and learning this, and almost always getting things wrong, because if you twist certain carbon atoms a certain way and you draw it incorrectly, you are just wrong. And organic chemistry was really hard.
No, I think you're thinking biochemistry, organic chemistry. I don't remember ever drawing anything.
Really? Did
Yeah.
you did take it though, right?
Yeah, just look at my transcript the other day. I took it. We'll just leave it at that. I took it.
You're just like, oh man, you woke up. Did I take organic? Oh, I did. Okay, you just check your transcript and you want to make sure that it was in there.
No, Ethan's thinking about medical school, and I was like, oh, we'll go through whatever.
Well, I remember organic chemistry. I got through it. I did have a good grade at the end of it. But if I was to explain a lot of the concepts months after, there's no way I could. When I took biochemistry, I understood organic chemistry way better. So I think, Mike, you are wrong. I think biochemistry is much more intuitive and easy. They can't see you shrugging on the air.
I feel like, for me, organic chemistry it came more naturally. It's like more calculus based, and biochemistry was just a little bit more challenging. I don't know.
Yeah, fair.
Calculus, like, you're just arranging numbers in a sentence rather than drawing structures.
Calculus is arranging numbers in a sentence. I don't hate that. That's not wrong. You're not wrong.
Yeah.
But anyway, chirality, you have a good example here too, Patrick, in trying to explain kind of how this can affect medication. I don't think I have a better one. So why don't you go ahead and share it?
Yeah, so the one that most of your audience is going to be familiar with probably is ibuprofen, where the actual molecule has a chiral version of itself. So there's left-handed and right-handed ibuprofen, and I think it's the right-handed version that is like actually 100 times more effective as an analgesic than the other hand. So it's, it is relevant still to medical applications, but Pasteur was still doing this all as a chemist.
Original. Cool.
So the next thing he did was move on to fermentation. And this was a big deal because there was this big debate about whether fermentation was chemical or biological. At first, Pasteur thought it was mostly a chemical thing, but then after doing his experiments, he was like, no, there's just too many microbes. There's got to be some kind of biology going on in there. So he published 2 big papers, one in 1857 about lactic acid, and then another in 1858 about alcohol fermentation. And that kind of got him interested in fermentation and put his name out there even further.
I, too, was interested in fermentation as I used to brew beer back in medical school and just before that. And I have to say, the more you learn about fermentation, the darker the metaphor becomes when you make beer, because what you do is you're creating this sugary water, this broth, the wort, if you will, for the yeast. You throw the yeast in there, and then they are going to eat the sugar. They're going to produce their excrement, which is delicious alcohol. And then they're going to do that to a point where their population outgrows the ability to sustain itself, and then they will all die off because they use up all their resources. And it's a very the more I did it, I was like, this
some
is kind
alien god comes in and harvests their spoils.
Basically, yes. So I think I think fermentation is fascinating because it is a scary metaphor for our own existence. Do you ever think about it that way?
That is scary.
There's a lot of pausing right now.
I'm not very good at cleaning. When I brewed, I discovered bacteria on my second batch.
Well, I'm going to hop to the next section of the script then. I gotta hang with these dads, man. You guys are putting me to shame. All right, next thing, spontaneous generation. So I don't know if you guys learned about this in middle school too, but I feel like this is one of the most most famous experiments done. This is where he did he's got the swan neck flasks. You remember these things? They have the big bulb there that has the broth, a vertical neck, and then the dippy part of the flask. And so what he did was fill them with broth, obviously a good media for culturing bacteria, and then heat them up, kill the bacteria inside, and then just sees what happens. He takes some of them, he breaks the neck off of some of them, he sees that the open flasks are the ones that develop bacteria. This gives him the idea that you need, if you have a closed off container, then it's not going to spontaneously generate within the broth.
Right.
Right.
And I was going to say too, tying back into germ theory, the fact that people back then used to think, for one example, I remember when I heard about this experiment, I remember there was a thought that people, let's say you leave some meat out or something and it goes bad and then you get maggots in it. There was a whole school of thought that said, well, those maggots just spontaneously come from the meat. They just grow in the meat, and that's what happens. And so, it took a while for people to be like, wait, I think the flies landing on it have something to do with the gross worms that grow out of it. And that's where they were starting, back in these days. Things seem to appear from nowhere, and then now you have this introduction of the microbial world, which you can't see without the right tools. And starting to put these connections together where, if you boil the broth and you kill off the bacteria, there's nothing in there.
Yeah. And so Pasteur kind of needed the earlier experiments on fermentation to show there are microbes inside. That's probably the thing that is resulting in fermentation, in order to know, if I apply heat, that's what's going to potentially kill off the bacteria inside. And so from that, he got the idea that, of course, you could heat up whatever the beverage was, beer, milk, wine, kill off some of the bacteria inside.
Gross.
But that would delay spoiling, because without microbes, then you can't get the grossness and putrefaction that results from all the bacteria doing their thing.
And so you can't get the listeria from the cheese either.
You know what? I find it just becomes a little too spicy with the listeria. So he publishes his first big paper on this 1863, and then finally patented the process of pasteurization in 1865.
Process is just heating stuff up. He named
It's
it
just
after
that,
himself with heating stuff.
You know, I was thinking, like, while I was putting this all together, like, okay, we have beer, we have cheese, and I'm talking to two guys from Wisconsin.
We have
Like, they really owe,
This is
they really
our
owe
culture.
like their economy to Pasteur. Yeah.
I was Michael really liked this example. So I was at a recent live wrestling show of a national show, and it's taped and it's televised. And one of the bad guy wrestlers came out and was saying disparaging things about the crowd, commenting on our looks as Wisconsinites and everything like that. And the crowd responded in mass by chanting beer and cheese at him. And I was very proud, actually. Single tear rolling down my face. It is really our culture up here.
Was that like when Freddie Mercury performed at Live Aid and it captivated a nation? It was like the same type of thing.
Exactly the same energy, same scale.
To move on with this one, this is around the time that we meet another character that you guys have covered before, and that is Joseph Lister,
Oh,
who
yes.
was reading a lot of Pasteur's work and being like, hey, I can apply this to surgery if all this air is causing the patient's surgical wounds to get infected. Then all I got to do is like sterilize this air or clean up the air, and then they'll be okay. And of course, like that led to enormous advancements in surgery.
Yeah, and like the actual introduction of using scientific method in surgical practice, which again we said in the episode seems like it shouldn't be such a revolutionary concept, but yeah, it was at the time. So you're absolutely right. These are giants of the field of not only medical history but just science in medicine generally.
Yeah, which gives us a good framing for kind of the next part of the story and where he comes into contact with Koch. But it's now about the 1870s. Pasteur has already had this like mega successful career. He revolutionized both like food preservation and then had this influence on medicine. And then later on in the 60s, the 1860s, he helped figure out how to stop an epidemic of disease in France's silkworms, which helped out, of course, like, France again, because if they do two things well, it is wine and silk back then.
I am just picturing these like tiny, adorable little needles and vaccinations for silkworms, and then there's a bunch of silkworms that get upset about it and then start protesting and doing their own silkworm research. And is that all what happened, or how did that play out?
It was actually less, it wasn't even that technical. He was just like, hey, what if we separate the worms with disease from the ones without disease? And it worked.
But then, so he forced quarantine. He forced the worms to quarantine?
Yeah, social distancing, quarantine, whatever you want to call it, for worms.
Okay.
Absolutely. Okay, so this is where we finally meet Robert Koch. Like I said earlier, he's 20 years younger than Pasteur, and he studied under an anatomist that you might not realize you've heard of, Friedrich Gustav Jacob Henle. Max, we already talked about this, but Mike, kind of your second quiz of the day, what is Jacob Henle known for?
He's known for those collarless shirts that have the buttons down the middle. Thinking like it goes down that far. That was a big contribution to society.
Yes. You guys are reading
I
yourselves.
wrote a little note in here. I don't know if you saw it, but I read that and I go, oh yeah, Henle. And I said, loop of
the
Henle.
loop of Henle.
Yeah.
Yeah, loop of
And
Henle.
then I sat
very
back
good.
in my chair and I was like, where is that? It's like, is it? It's like, no.
Kidney, man.
Attaboy. Yeah. So yeah, it's a
Yeah.
it's a like microanatomy structure of the kidney where you do a bunch of salt exchange, etc. I'd get into the specifics off the top of my head, but I
You
just
would,
don't want
wouldn't you?
I would 10 years ago. I don't know if I would now.
Dude, the way that I teach this is like, all right, you got that classic cross section of a kidney where you open it up and you got like the renal pyramids that you see, and then you see like the little thin line around it. That's the renal cortex. And then you have like the layers in between, the medulla. And so the loop of Henle is the part that goes from the cortex, the thin little apple peel of a layer, and then dips down into the medulla and then comes back. That's the loop part of it.
I prefer what I heard once from a infectious disease specialist, that is the kidney just works by magic. Move on. It's just magic. There's no physics. It's just magic. They think they know. It's a magic organ. It's just accept it and move on.
We love you, nephrologists. Yeah. Well, I do. I can't speak for you guys.
We know.
right.
Good. We have good nephrologists around us.
Yeah. Okay, so in 1840, now Henle came up with a set of criteria that he would use to show that a microbe caused disease. Here's what they were. You had to consistently find the microbe alongside the disease. You had to isolate the microbe from living tissues. Then it had to produce the disease when you gave that microbe to a test animal. And these criteria became known as Henle's postulates. And right now, anybody who's familiar with Koch is like, okay, I see where this is going. And you're probably right. We're foreshadowing a little bit here.
So did he just take Henley's postulates and say they're mine now?
The timeline is a little bit off. This is his teacher, and
right.
yeah, at this point, I don't think Koch was born. I have to fact check that.
Got it. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, so I think we're sound there. It's a good alibi.
Well, no, I mean, did Koch take Henley's postulates?
Oh, we'll get there. We'll get there.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. So Koch graduates from school. He was already coming in with his influence of his, teacher who had done all this work with his postulates and infectious disease. So he was already primed to look for germs as the cause of disease. He wasn't starting from scratch and having these eureka moments. But other than having a well-respected teacher, he didn't have any big accolades before going into the next chapter, which is anthrax. So Koch starts working around the countryside. Local livestock are just getting wrecked by anthrax. And this is probably going to be more relevant. Like, I think in modern day, we're more familiar with anthrax from the bioterrorism angle. But back then, they would have been more familiar with it as a livestock disease. So we should get a little bit of like familiarity with the biology of anthrax. And we are definitely not experts here. But here's our crash course.
I looked through it. I think your crash course is accurate.
Okay, cool. Here we go. So anthrax is a little rod-shaped bacteria that can turn into a spore outside of its host and live dormant underground for long periods of time. There's a bunch of different ways of getting anthrax, like it could come through breaks in the skin or through the GI tract, which is how most of these like cow and sheep were getting it. They're just eating it through the grass that they were munching on. Then when the anthrax spore gets into the body, it reactivates and turns into its rod-shaped pathogenic form, and then it can kill their host within like 36 to 72 hours. So like sometimes that cattle farmer or whatever wouldn't recognize that there was anything wrong with the cattle until they were just dropping dead out in the field.
Yeah, and anthrax is a pretty nasty illness. It can cause a really bad pneumonia, and it can be fatal. It can be treated with antibiotics nowadays. But yeah, you pointing back to the spore thing, that is a kind of an interesting feature of anthrax. The fact that unlike other bacteria, where if they're not in an environment that is, like let's say Staphylococcus, which lives on your skin, is perfectly happy to live on your skin. Strep can do the same thing, but if it's not on a surface like that, it may not last long or it may not thrive. Whereas anthrax can basically cause itself to form into a little spore, and it coats itself in it's like a biofilm is kind of another way of putting it, but it's like a little shield, and it can sit in the environment, without any food or drink, more or less, just to simplify, for a long time. And then if you get exposed to those spores, it can then reactivate and, as you said, transform and become a really bad, nasty infectious illness. And not a lot of bacteria are capable of those kind of maneuvers, so that makes this a particularly interesting one.
Yeah. So, nasty disease. A few years earlier, just by coincidence, a separate rivalry of French and German scientists found the bacteria that tended to show up in anthrax. And this is where it just gets like, all right, we get it. You two countries hate each other. Mm-hmm. The Germans called it Bacillus anthracis. The French called it Bacteridium anthracis. Again, coming from the same idea. It is a matter of like, oh, well, we found this one. We're calling it this.
I really like petty distinctions, so I respect that.
But the German nomenclature, I think, stuck. Didn't it?
That's the one. Yep.
So they
we'll
won
see
that
why
battle.
in a second.
Well, they lost the war, but they won the battle.
There you go.
So, given his mentor's postulates, if Koch found the bacillus, he could show that it wasn't just an association, but that was actually a cause and effect relationship. So how is he going to do that? He goes and gets a bunch of infected sheep. He finds Bacillus anthracis in those cows, sheep, everything that he dissects. And then he does something cool. He puts the bacteria into cow eyeball fluid, the aqueous material, and then gets the bacteria to multiply.
I like that he just has that laying around. He's like, is he married to a witch or something?
He has a lot of dead cows to work with, Max.
So he's like, I'll go for the eyeball fluid? Like, there's got to be other fluids that you might try first. I don't know.
Oh,
It's
like
just
what?
me. It's just me.
Like what? Name one other fluid that he could use.
Blood, urine,
Well, the blood's going to
cerebrospinal
coagulate.
fluid.
Yeah.
Oh,
the
man.
eyeball fluid's easy to get to.
I mean, yeah, but it's so skeezy. I guess he's, covered in blood, anthrax-infected sheep blood, and he was like, I don't know.
And just think of how risky
much
that
worse
was
is
for
a cow
him.
eye? Oh my gosh.
Could
yeah,
you
it's
imagine?
mind-blowing. It's, because I'm sure he doesn't, maybe he has a smock on.
I'm going to... Man, I got to come back to this later because you're foreshadowing something like, oh, what else could you use? You will not believe what inventions came out of Koch's lab later on in the story. But I don't have it written down. I'll have to ad-lib a little bit, but I think you'll like it. Okay, yeah.
I'm excited and scared.
Okay, you'll be okay.
Right.
Okay, So he's got these cultures of bacteria in the aqueous, cow eyeball fluid. He takes the cultures, he injects it into experimental mice, and they developed anthrax. That was such a big deal because this was the first time that anybody had tested the idea that a specific germ could cause a specific disease. This is like the main idea of germ theory. He put in Bacillus anthracis and they got anthrax. They didn't get tuberculosis. They didn't get syphilis. Like, they got the disease that we thought the germ was going to cause. That was a big deal.
That's put better than what I said at the beginning of the episode. But yes, that was what that's what I was thinking of when you said this. I do like going back to some of the terminology that I just like to hang on because I just find words to be interesting. I love that they turn this into, the phrase is culture of bacteria, which I just like. It's kind of a whimsical term. Like, I always imagine that in those little bubbling, or not the bubbling because they already heated, but like you have this broth and there's a bunch of bacteria and they're growing and they form this like whole culture. There's like a whole civilization, of bacteria, and they're all like, they have different roles. The bacteria evolve, and then like some of them are, there's probably like little doctor bacteria, and then there's like little tax accountant bacteria, and then there's like leadership, and they like go through all this political strife, and they have this whole culture that is rapidly growing because of the way that they can reproduce. And then you just take a bunch of antibiotics and spray them on the plate to see if they work, and you annihilate the entire culture and civilization of bacteria.
How do you know that's not us, Max?
It's fairly. I'm
Think
just
about
saying.
it. We could be on a spore of something in the universe. We could be the bacteria.
I don't know that we're not. I don't know that we're not. Going back to my fermentation analogy, I'm just going for the dark metaphors today. I don't know why.
Yeah. So he's got this like central tenet of germ theory bubbling. He publishes his first anthrax paper in 1876, and then he publishes again in 1877, and he just like becomes a superstar right away. Then in 1878, he follows his mentor's footsteps and publishes his own version of Koch's postulates. So this is probably not where most people thought the Koch's postulates come from. We're going to revisit them later on. Koch had a bunch of different versions of the postulates over the course of his career as he learned new things, but this was the first time that he wrote them down. Basically, here's how you can tell whether germ X causes disease Y. At this point, they're really similar to Henle's postulate, so I'm not going to repeat them again. But Koch is like a big player on the international science stage, which is how Louis Pasteur comes back into the story.
Oh, the two titans become aware of each other.
Okay, so one of the big things in Koch's initial report was that he saw that the bacteria form these little spores, which we already explained, and that let them survive outside of the host, but he couldn't figure out how then the spore made the host sick. He just knew that if you injected it back into the animal, it got anthrax. So like he was missing a little bit of the mechanism. So in 1878, Pasteur's lab basically repeated Koch's experiments, but used a little bit of a different technique with serial dilutions. It's boring to explain. And from that, Pasteur reasoned that the anthrax spore could morph into the rod-shaped infectious bacillus in the body, and that's the one that caused disease, which is pretty like ingenious stuff.
That's an insane connection for them to make because, yeah, it's basically they find the spore, then they find samples of the disease, and he's able to connect that this little tiny spore thing became this rod-shaped bacteria and that they are connected without, he doesn't have the benefit of genetic testing, doesn't have the benefit of electron microscopes, doesn't have any of this stuff where they can observe it in real time. And so that's an amazing connection to make. Yes,
absolutely. So now becomes the battle of like who discovered what, who gets the credit, which is always going to be a battle within medical history. And, in history of science, history of any kind
hubris
of
and
discovery.
Science and medical history. No,
of course not. No, I mean, who cares whether, what was first? The real battle is who makes it popular. So in 1878, Pasteur writes a summary paper of the last couple years of his work to the Academy of Sciences. Here's the quote. I ask the Academy not to dismiss these curious results before I demonstrate one important theoretical conclusion. We insist on demonstrating at the start of these studies that are opening a whole new world of knowledge, a proof that the cause of transmissible, contagious, and infectious diseases resides essentially and uniquely in the presence of microorganisms. End quote. And that is, he's saying like germ theory is this thing now, like germs cause disease.
That's hubris.
Absolutely.
I have an amazing conclusion. You're going to be aware of it. It is that good, and I'm proving this. Done.
But he doesn't really acknowledge like Koch's recent work. I mean, I'm sure he had heard of it at that point. It isn't just by coincidence that he starts working on anthrax. right after Koch had made this monumental discovery about like, here's the bacteria that causes it, and here's how you could replicate it a bunch.
Yeah, it's maybe you just forgot. He probably got a lot of papers on his desk. Maybe you read about it. Maybe you forgot. Honest mistake.
Well, of course, he refers to it the French way, Bacteria anthracis. I read that he did acknowledge that the Germans call it Bacillus anthracis, but otherwise, didn't mention Koch.
No.
So this probably, while this is all going on, this is probably not personal beef. This is probably not like, Koch called me a name one time. It probably has to do with some pretty gnarly national rivalries. The Franco-Prussian War had just happened in the 1870s. France lost this. I don't know a ton of geopolitical history, so I don't know if this was like before or after German unification. But like, depending on the timeline, Germany might not have been a country at this point.
Okay.
But either way, like cultural rivalry was a big deal. It didn't matter what like the name of your country was necessarily. We just know like we're fighting with those guys.
Us versus them, man. Oldest story in time.
So, okay, then everything keeps on accelerating. In 1879, Pasteur and his team developed a vaccine against chicken cholera by exposing the germ that causes it to the air a bunch of times and just kept on culturing it, kept on repeating it and replicating it. Those new, weaker versions of the germs weren't able to cause disease as easily as the normal bacteria, which is the process of attenuation, which obviously is still used today. Live attenuated vaccines are still like a very popular option.
I like that it's basically like chicken cholera as a Gen X kid, just being forced to go outside and play in the air repeatedly until it's exhausted.
Well, I mean, anthrax had already touched the grass. So it's we have a couple cultural references there.
That's fair.
So Pasteur started working on an anthrax vaccine next, but it didn't behave quite as easily, and it wasn't as easy to manipulate as the chicken cholera. Remember, like Bacillus anthracis is really hardy. It forms a spore when it's exposed to air, and so no matter how many times the Pasteur lab tried to replicate the bacillus, they couldn't create an attenuated version. Again, makes sense for the biology of anthrax. This is what it does. So it's no surprise that like the repeated exposures to air didn't reduce virulence. So
I think chicken cholera sounds gross. Like just going back to that, like chicken cholera as a disease is probably really horrible to deal with.
I do
Human
prefer
cholera
chicken
is pretty
nuggets.
awful. They're not nuggets at that point.
Yeah, it's a weird soup, we'll say. Okay. Yeah. So, okay.
A lot of diarrhea.
So they're trying to figure out what to do with anthrax. They decide to add heat. They found it was like really delicate. 45 Celsius, too hot, they killed it. 42 to 43 Celsius was just right for keeping the culture alive and replicating, but making it less virulent so that they can then give it and produce immunity. So fast forward to May of 1881. Pasteur does this big public experiment. He takes 50 sheep, he gives them all anthrax, and vaccinates half of them, and then the other half are controls. And sure enough, the vaccinated half all lived, the unvaccinated half all died. He got a ton of publicity for it, and he has very firmly like stolen the spotlight back from Koch.
I want to say that I'm glad we've moved past doing mass demonstrations of like really grim animal research. I'm glad that it's no longer like a public display of these sort of things, but I'm not sure that I'm glad that it's just tucked away behind closed doors.
Well, buddy, wait until you hear the rabies story.
No,
we're not going to cover it
no.
here. I know it's like I can like, all right, I understand. Like I eat meat, and so like this kind of stuff happens. But man, once you bring in dogs, it just gets so much more grim. This is a dark episode, isn't it?
Yeah, well, they all are really.
So we're coming back. Pasteur had done this big experiment, makes a big splash. Koch responds by saying, Pasteur follows the tactic of communicating only favorable aspects of his experiments and of ignoring even decisive unfavorable results. Such behavior may be appropriate for commercial advertising, but in science it must be totally rejected. His behavior is simply inexplicable.
I feel like it's pretty explicable. You always share the good things, man.
Yeah, I mean, this was a big thing in Pasteur's time, too. He was getting on the cover of magazines. He was properly famous. And of course, like a bunch of his rivals, whether they were German, French, anywhere else, they were like, you're too much of a showman, dude. Like, we can't take your science seriously. And maybe we're a little jealous, too. But he was like well known for having an ego and being a showman.
That could have been a generational thing, too, because he was used to like these shows. Like, this is how we show medicine. We show the people how we do it. And then kind of the scientific method is being born. And these other guys are like, hey, you figure it out. Once you know it exactly how it's supposed to be, that's when you share your results.
Mm-hmm. And this is, too, also, the peak of international rivalries. After this, we get to international cooperation. So once we get to like the 1900s and the work around penicillin, that's a way more international and collaborative work between the UK, Australia, American production. Like that's a whole other series I'm sure you could do.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, the more modern example is the COVID vaccines. I mean, that was worldwide collaboration and actually pretty incredible stuff.
Yeah. So again, but this rivalry still gave us a lot too, even if it was more comedy than collaboration. So, okay, from here, their careers start splitting paths. They're not going to butt heads a ton, but they're definitely going to be working in parallel. And so it's like, all right, Koch does something, Pasteur does something equally as big and bombastic, but in kind of his own different way. So right after this, Pasteur creates a rabies vaccine. This time, he attenuated it more similarly to the chicken cholera vaccine, just doing repeated cultures. This time, instead of his original medium, he's using like nervous tissue in both dogs and rabbits. Rabies didn't affect a ton of people at the time, but of course, rabies is such an emotional disease, both with our dogs, with like everybody kind of teared up a little bit thinking about like dog specimens, and so like he knew, oh, this is the one to get some attention.
Oh, I see. So he chooses this. I gotcha. So he chooses this subject or tries to do something that will help stop or prevent rabies because it's a very popular thing that people don't want to see anymore. I see what you're saying, but it is the thing that I want to point out to the listener here too is that the interesting part here is that rabies is viral. Chicken cholera is a bacterial illness. And so he's demonstrating, perhaps without knowing a lot of the nuance, I don't know that he knew that rabies was viral or that a virus was a distinct thing.
This comes up later in the legacies too, because one of Pasteur's students, Charles Chamberlain, invents this filter where you could take a culture of whatever, filter out the bacteria, and then whatever was left could be just water. Or it could be this own infectious thing. Whatever was left that was infectious in that solution could either be a toxin that was too small to get through the filter or viruses. So they deduced that viruses were a thing before they were able to see them. Obviously, like well before, electron microscopes.
Sure. They weren't able to see them, but they could find evidence that they were that there was something else there. That's really cool. Those filters, I think they went on to use them in Chemex coffee makers. I mean, they're very, very, very good.
You think so?
What's that? No, I don't. I just made that up.
Okay. Sure. But I mean, these filters too were like sold as a way of purifying your water, making it safer to drink too. So it wasn't just a scientific tool. There was a commercial option there too. I also don't want to make it seem like Pasteur was just motivated by fame and fortune. There was good to be done too.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
We'll give him that one.
Yeah. It's easy to dunk on old guys. Okay.
Old dead guy.
Old dead. Yeah. Talk back now, Pasteur. Louis. So the next one, though, rabies was, emotionally charged, but tuberculosis, which is what Koch discovered next, was like the big one. It's still obviously a big deal today. Your episode that came out came out today, was all about tuberculosis and tuberculosis chic, which I thought, well done.
Oh yeah, that was a very interesting episode. Those stuff that Aaron did the episode. I had never known any of that, so it's really fun when I discover stuff that I didn't. Well, I didn't know about the chic, like the influence it had, but I knew about tuberculosis. But that was a cool episode. I think I agree.
Yeah. So that happened 1882. He publishes again in 1884, and this is where he updates Koch's postulates to be the version that most people would know today. Although again, they've been modified since. Tuberculosis, still a big deal, still kills, I believe, 1.5 million people every year, according to the WHO. So still obviously relevant, but the idea that now we could study it in more detail and potentially come up with a cure or a vaccine, huge deal in the 1880s.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, as you said, still big deal today.
Next up, Vibrio cholerae causing cholera. This one, I want to make a little bit of a distinction because you guys have, of course, heard of John Snow, the cholera epidemic in London in 1854.
Episode 1.
Was it really episode 1?
Yeah, it was episode 1. Yep.
Well done. Okay, cool. So we got all kinds of callbacks here, in part because germ theory is like the biggest deal in modern medicine.
Sure.
So Vibrio cholerae itself had actually been discovered the same year as the London epidemic, 1854, by an Italian scientist who, again, another eponym. You've heard of Pacini corpuscles in the skin, discovered by a Dr. Pacini. But the actual link between Vibrio cholerae causes cholera had not been made until Koch in the 1880s. And so, again, now that we know, like, all right, if germs can cause disease, let's figure out the cause and effect relationship of this. So that was Koch's big contribution there with cholera.
Fair enough.
Next up, 1885, Pasteur opens the first Pasteur Institute in Paris. This was the first research center for biomedical sciences. It's where a bunch of researchers started using the term microbiology instead of bacteriology.
Ooh, getting more
Koch
specialized.
Koch then decided he was going to do his own research. Unlike, yes, a funny phrase, unfortunately,
I'm
these
going to
days.
start my own. I'm going to have my own party with my own friends, and it's going to be way better than his party.
And very importantly, he was going to do his independent of government funding. So instead, he would fund his research through applied research. So basically becoming a pharma company. Unfortunately, his first efforts didn't work out so hot. So in 1890, he comes out with a substance called tuberculin, which he said was going to be this big tuberculosis treatment, but it was ineffective. It had bad side effects. And so it didn't work. Big embarrassment for him professionally. But this is now the substance that we use as the TB skin test, which we as Americans don't get the TB vaccine, which you guys talked about. But we still get the TB skin test. So again, not a totally useless invention. Didn't work as he expected, though.
Yeah, I mean, the skin test is kind of cool. The tuberculin is like this little protein that was isolated, and you just take a tiny needle, you put it right under the skin, you raise what's called a wheal. It's just like this little bump of fluid into the skin. And if you have been exposed to tuberculosis, what happens is that the immune system mounts a reaction in that area, and it will expand the wheal. You like read it by the size of like how big the swelling gets, etc. Or if you don't have any exposure to tuberculosis, your body does not react to the protein, and so that little wheal goes away. And it's also really convenient because everybody in employee health who is in charge of stabbing you with these needles will find you and make you do it like multiple times a year. I think they backed off it recently, but there was a time in residency I was like, please stop sticking me with these needles. I've had so many of these tests.
No, but yeah, if you have an exposure, you're going to have more, but it's usually once a year. But now it's way less.
I feel like ramping up into residency, especially, maybe it was more my medical school thing, but I feel like I got like 2 of these a year, just like in case.
That's what. Okay, so that initially got me interested in investigating, like, why don't Americans get the TB vaccine, and why do we do this whole thing with the skin test and everything?
It's so rare that we just don't. It's not the thing that you think of. It's a global problem, but it's not a U.S. problem.
Yeah, I do remember. I remember learning about the vaccine in medical school, and I haven't looked this up. I don't know the exact reason we don't use it here. I think one is it's like partially effective, or it's not super highly effective. And I think Mike's right. I think I remember it being something to the effect of there's just not a lot of need for it since there's so little exposure in cases to TB here in the U.S. But hey, give it time. When drug-resistant TB becomes a common thing, I will be in line to get my vaccine. I promise.
And so, if we go back to Koch, big failure. He's not making the profits that he wants. So, in 1891, the year after tuberculin comes out, he opens the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin with funding from the government. So, short-lived effort of his own. Good try, Robert.
Yeah, well, he had to have his own party, so that makes sense.
Yeah. So, Pasteur died 1895, but Koch, again, 20 years younger, had one more big trip in him. So in 1896, he starts off on this world tour and learns more about all kinds of stuff, including like acquired immunity is a thing. And then he died in 1910.
Probably less exciting than Anthrax's world tour in just a spectacle form.
Absolutely. So even in death, their legacies had a rivalry through the institutes that they founded. So this is going to be a bit of a whirlwind here. But first up, diphtheria. A team of Koch students found the diphtheria toxin, and one of them, Emil von Behring, obviously, well-known researcher in his own right, started working on a weakened antitoxin to create a vaccine.
It's also an episode 19 shout out.
That's right. That's the Balto one, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I love that one. That was one of the first ones I listened to for you guys.
Oh, yeah.
But of course, while they're doing that, the French are like, oh, but we have to come up with our own thing. So they come up with a serum therapy using the horse's blood in order to produce it, which it's always wild thinking that is a chapter of medical history. It's just like, all right, we got horses. What can we do with this?
Oh, yeah. It was also original treatment for pneumonia. It was kind of before antibiotics were common. They would take horse serum with antibodies to Streptococcus pneumoniae, and they would just give you horse serum because some of those antibodies would help stave off the infection. It's kind of like, I think, 1920s ish, if I remember correctly. But horses got a lot of fluids, not just in the eyeball.
Yeah, the era like right before sulfa drugs, and of course like a little bit before penicillin. Sure, horses. Mm-hmm. So next up, bringing it back to the original question at the intro of the episode, was syphilis. So Paul Ehrlich, I don't know, as we discussed, German, not our strong suit. He was a student of and collaborator with Koch. And after his time at the Koch Institute, he did a bunch of work with dyes, which led him to make salvarsan, which is one of the first antimicrobials, albeit it was, super narrow use. Syphilis was a big problem at the time. Antibiotics would become a much bigger deal, but this was a big proof of concept, what Ehrlich would have called a magic bullet, something that affected the pathogen, but not human cells. Big deal.
That's except for all the side effects from an arsenical compound, he was he's onto something. I definitely agree. Fun fact too, there's a tick-borne illness called ehrlichiosis, which was named in honor of Paul Ehrlich. He didn't find it, but
Ehrlichiosis.
Ehrlichiosis. And I just want to say, if anybody wants to honor me at some point in my legacy by naming a communicable disease that comes from a tick, I'm okay with that.
There's a tick-borne disease named after me.
Is there?
Babesiosis. Or babesiosis. Because I was a babe.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen? I've seen a case of that. Have you?
That
was the one time.
Those are tough. Like one, I thought it was like anaplasmosis versus babesiosis versus Rocky Mountain spotted fever.
Yeah. No, I only bring it up because there was the one time I ever saw a pathologist come running into the ER excited about something. I had a case where a person was like, hey, I feel sick and I'm a little jaundiced, and by the way, I had a tick on me 3 weeks ago. Do you think that's related? And I was like, I don't know, maybe. So I sent off a blood smear, and within 30 minutes or something, there's this disheveled white-coated person in the ER looking for me, and was, who are you? And it's like, oh, I'm a pathologist. They have babesiosis, and he had like a slide with him. I was like, that's cool. Like, you're really excited. Okay, you came all the way up here. I like it. But it's fun stuff.
If that's your definition of fun, power to you.
I'm a weird guy. Patrick.
Mm-hmm. Next up, plague. So one of the scientists who worked with the Pasteur Institute, and especially with one of those researchers who worked on diphtheria, was a guy named Alexander Yersin, who you probably know as the namesake of Yersinia pestis, which he identified, after leaving the Pasteur Institute, but this was now going to be the bacteria that causes plague.
Yep. If I discover a pathogen like that, I'm definitely naming it after myself. I absolutely would do that.
Can you be happy with the glutamax?
I'll think about it.
I mean, far and away one of everybody's favorite mussels.
Looks like corned beef when you dissect it.
Cool. Thank you for ruining butts.
It really does. It looks like I could have corned beef.
All right, we're gonna return back to tuberculosis here. So while Koch tried to cure tuberculosis with the tuberculin, which wasn't super successful, two French scientists at the Pasteur Institute spent the early 20th century creating a more effective anti-tuberculosis vaccine called the BCG, which stands for Bacille Calmette Guerin. And so that was our TB vaccine, which I think is still the one used today. And then this one, before we get into the last little bit here, I promised we're going to talk about cow eyeball fluids again. So while working on identifying certain causative germs, they realized we need something that's better than broth because everything grows in broth. And so
you might accidentally drink it if you don't realize it's bacterial broth.
Our cholera soups, yeah. And so some scientists at the Koch Institute are like, all right, we'll figure out something. They try using gelatin. Gelatin doesn't work super well because it melts at too low of a temperature. And there are some bacteria that can just like nibble through it. And so it doesn't stay smooth. It's harder to work with. And so one of the lab assistant's wives, who was actually getting involved in the lab in her own right, her name was Fanny Hess. She's like, hey, I've been using this stuff for vegetable jellies and it might work. It's called agar. You want to try that? And so sure enough, they're like, oh, this actually is fantastic. It's still transparent. It doesn't melt at too low of a temperature. This is great. And so like, I know we were kind of teasing about like why cow eyeball fluids, but if you think about it, like that's kind of like agar. You know, it's not liquid. It's not watery. It's still got some solid to it. If you dissected cow eyeballs, then you know it's like, yeah, it's got a little viscosity
firmness,
to it.
A little firmness, a little bounce.
Mm-hmm. And so here is bringing it all together. They used agar as their growth media, and then one other lab assistant at Koch's lab invented the Petri dish. Julius Richard Petri. So you have this combination of like Petri dish, agar, and now it's like, cool, that is like a modern biology lab right there.
Yeah. And if a listener is just never, you may not have been in a micro lab, like you probably know maybe what a Petri dish is, but it's usually filled with warm agar, which, you know, you fill it up about halfway and that solidifies into like a super firm jello like consistency. And then you smear your swab on there and watch bacteria grow a couple days later, but sometimes immediately. You know, pretty cool.
I know. And sometimes that high melting point is frustrating too. Like I've been in the situation having to clean up the agar from these dishes, and it's just like, all right, cool, we just got it out of the autoclave and it's solid again.
I thought that's what lab interns were hired for.
That was me.
That's right.
I work at a high school. We don't have interns.
Budget cuts. Yeah.
You have students. They're even more free labor.
Yeah.
Are we not allowed to use them as labor? I don't know how that works.
Around the autoclave, it gets a little bit dicey, probably.
Probably.
Yeah,
probably
I still have to do that. Yeah. So I get it. Safety, apparently our number one value. So, I mean, all this cool stuff just stems off of these two labs from these diseases that everyone's heard of: diphtheria, syphilis, plague, tuberculosis, huge deals. And then from there, the Pasteur Institute expands globally, including there's one in New York City, which I think is the only US-based Pasteur Institute, but there's, institutes all over the world. They start working on like epidemic typhus and typhoid, all kinds of stuff. The Robert Koch Institute, however, then started getting used in World War II with Nazis. So we're going to end that one there.
Yeah, we do there's more than one episode that unfortunately we have to end there because it's just Nazis. Boo.
Yeah.
They ruin everything.
So
they really do.
I'll throw it out to you guys. As far as, the biggest legacy, are we going to say that Pasteur wins or Koch wins?
That one's tough. I would say based on everyday stuff. I mean, like I've got milk in my fridge, and I have got milk in my fridge because of Pasteur.
That's actually really good logic. Yeah. I think if you go, more people have heard of pasteurization than Koch's postulates. So I think in the common parlance, Pasteur probably is the winner there, but there's a lot of good stuff that you can trace through Koch's work and his legacy. And so, I mean, really, it's all complementary. There are no winners or losers here, right?
It could be that Koch saved more lives.
Might be.
Pasteur is more well known.
And he made a bunch of cheese snobs angry because they want their cheese without pasteurization. So,
and how long did humans ferment things? I mean, are we talking about thousands of years? And for him, then at this point in time, to figure out what it actually means to do that, I mean, they've known about this stuff for millennia.
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember watching like nature videos of like chimpanzees like throwing fruit onto the ground and then letting it ferment and then getting drunk on it. So I think the knowledge of fermentation as a thing has been probably the first of our species. We're like, hey, let's find a way to get drunk. But but you're right. Some of these things have hidden in plain sight for so long.
The book closest to me right now is this one, Wine, 9,000 Years of Wine, and how like fermented foods are just so important to our species, whether it is like, drinks, and sometimes that was safer than water, or whether it was like, we need fermented foods because it's a good source of nutrition, and we can tell like, yep, that one's going to be safe. That's good. It may stink a little bit, but like that's better than potentially dying,
I was making my own homemade kombucha for a little bit. And if anybody's ever had the pleasure, you make whatever tea you want. You put a bunch of sugar in it, and then you put a SCOBY in there, which is a big slime ball of bacteria and yeast, and then they ferment it. And so it doesn't. They don't make necessarily alcohol in a significant amount, but they change the flavor of it, and it's pleasant. And some people are just not a fan, and I get that. It's cool. But we were making it. The one thing you got to be aware of is that giant slime ball is apparently really tasty to fruit flies, and so it can be really gross if you do not seal it up well enough, and that's why I buy it at the store now.
So the reason why I got up initially is because I had a homemade kombucha and it tasted like ass, so I had to chuck it. It must have sat in my fridge for too long.
Fermentation, we've had it for a while, but not everybody's good at it. It's just how things work.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I think there's no true winners or losers. I think it's
humanity is the winner.
It's a wash. We're all better for it. You're right. Well,
yeah.
With that, I want to say very many thanks once again, Patrick, for coming on the show, for doing all this amazing research, and we will have all the show notes linked. We'll have all the sources, all that stuff for anybody who wants to go check it out. But at the moment, if you have a need to fill your time, please go over to his channel, the new channel at Pat Kelly Teaches, correct? Over
Confirmed,
on YouTube?
Yep.
And if you forget that because you're just listening to this, just go to our show notes because I will have a link there, and really go check out the stuff. It's if anybody's ever done video work, like, it's so much work, and you just make it look really easy, and it should be appreciated. So with that, thanks for being on again, man.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Pat.
Well, with that, we appreciate everyone listening, and we'd love to hear from all of you out there. If you'd like to send us a message or provide feedback, we can be reached through our website, www.poorhistorianspod.com. There you will find links to all our social media sites. We take emails at poorhistorianspod@gmail.com, and we work to respond to all posts on our various social media accounts. Send us a medical history question there as well to test Mike's innate knowledge and try to win your own medical eponym. Seriously, send them in because it's a lot of fun, and we get to watch Mike squirm. If you have time, please go and leave us a nice 5-star review on iTunes or whichever platform you choose. And if you're old-fashioned, find and refurbish a Gutenberg press and use it to stamp out a message. I'm not sure how that press really worked, to be fair, but I'm sure it's old-timey enough to do the job here. Until next time, the Poor Historians are signing out. AMA. I wanted to ask you about, like, do you have people that comment on your videos about germ theory denial?
Oh, dude.
Is this historically or current day?
No, this is currently.
Dude. Yeah. What's wild is, all right, and I don't know how much of this is going to be useful material, but yes, germ theory denialism is a big deal on the internet. I don't know how much it actually affects people's day-to-day lives or if they're just really loud online.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, but yeah, I mean, my comment section, whenever I talk about like the benefits of vaccines or or antibiotics, and this is, I knew that going into this video, making one specifically about the history of germ theory, that if you look at other videos about germ theory, there are germ theory denialists in the comment section saying, like, you need to educate yourself. You need to talk about, like, this guy, this guy, this guy. And so I noticed a couple different themes and a couple names popping up. They were terrain theory and Antoine Béchat. And so there's a whole separate sub-rivalry that follows the germ theory episode that we just talked about, where Pasteur was doing his initial fermentation research. There was this older French researcher, Antoine Béchat, who he believed in this theory called zymotic theory. Have you guys ever heard of this?
I feel like that word's familiar, but I don't know what it is.
Well, yeah, because zymes, Z-Y-M-E, then kind of transitioned etymologically into enzymes. They were,
Oh.
obviously chemicals that are
Like zines?
Catalyzed.
When we had magazines were just called zines?
definitely not that. No. And so this idea was like, all right, these little zymes are so much tinier than cells, and they live inside of our cells, like kind of like midichlorians, if you know the Star Wars reference.
Oh, we know the Star Wars reference, my friend.
That's awesome.
Got it. Okay. So these things live inside all cells, and then like certain aspects of the cell, of the terrain that these zymes live in, can get them to transform into different things, including bacteria, which can then make their host sick. And thus, disease doesn't have to do with infectious diseases coming in, or like a pathogen coming into the body. It has to do with like, how healthy are you?
Okay.
You can kind of start putting this together about why these kind of people wouldn't like vaccines, and why they,
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So
Yeah.
zymotic theory, terrain theory becomes a thing. Béchat, just dukes it out with Pasteur over fermentation.
Like literally?
Because,
oh, no.
Well, they exchanged words similar to, Koch
No
and Pasteur. As far as I know, no.
Okay.
And so, they argued about like who deserves to have discovered biological fermentation. Neither of them really deserve the credit. Again, Pasteur made it popular, but was not the first like to say like, hey, I think that cells are involved in fermentation. And so Béchat says he's got a claim to it. Pasteur says he's the right one. And this just kicks off this rivalry that continues for the rest of Pasteur's life. Again, he dies in 1895. And then Béchat's life dies in 1909, I think, early 20th century. And they have another fight again over that silkworm thing. Béchat said like, okay, I've got this.
Who hasn't?
We're going to, yeah. So they fight again. And then they kind of, split ways. But Béchat just stays incredibly bitter about Pasteur's life and success. And so in 1911, there's this book that's published posthumously from Béchat's work. It's called, I put it in the video, The Blood and Its Third Anatomical Element. The premise of this book is that like fibrin, the blood clotting factor in blood, totally made up. It's actually a bunch of zymes that like coagulate the blood themselves, and thus like Béchat's correct.
Boy.
Pasteur doesn't know anything.
I would have called the book Zyme Time.
Yeah, there's
I'm
your
gonna-
zine, Max.
I was going to say, publishing a posthumous book. I don't know how much say you get over the title. You got to spell it out pretty quickly.
Yeah,
I would have left that in my
the
will.
subtitle is even longer.
Zyme time. Call whatever I wrote Zyme
Zyme
time.
time. I like that. But anyway, dude, I read the entire thing, and like the introduction to this thing, the translator is just like it's culty.
How long is this?
This was hundreds of pages. It's on
God.
Google Books. I know,
Okay.
dude. I spent way too much time on this one. Again, like I wanted to understand the perspective of these people because
You know
they're
that
still
they
around.
didn't read
and,
that
like,
book, Pat. They didn't read that
no,
book.
I know. But that's the thing. Like, if you want to teach stuff, I genuinely believe you need to understand things many layers deeper than the stuff that you're presenting. And
Sure,
so,
sure.
like, yes, and like genuinely, I'm curious about this stuff too. Not that I think it's going to be true, but I want to understand, like, all right, why do people think the way that they do?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I have interest in a lot of quack medicine. Obviously, I don't think it's true, but it's fascinating to see how certain things were developed and they become popular, and the why they become popular is also kind of an important question. I was going to say I was listening to I think it's either Skeptics with a K or Be Reasonable podcast, and I think it's Be Reasonable, and there's a guy, Michael Marshall. He's a skeptic in the UK. He's actually the head of the UK Skeptics Society, Merseyside Skeptics, I think. But he's a wonderful interviewer, and he will have on people like flat earthers and vaccine deniers, etc. He'll have them on and have a very honest, like, kind of discussion with them, and in a way that that can go one of two ways. You can either have somebody on and inadvertently platform them without any context, but he doesn't. He'll have them on and he will be very polite, but he'll challenge their views and in a very, again, polite British way. But he had recently, one of his episodes was and I don't remember the person's name, but they were a husband and wife couple who were germ theory denialists, and I could get through about 15 minutes of it, and it was so insane because they're just like, well, there's no proof that microorganisms cause illness, and I'm just like, what? And then they're kind of going on this really, these shaky grounds. Well, no, we can't actually show that this does this and this, and it was so maddening given for my profession. I just like, normally I could sit through him talking to a flat earther and just roll my eyes, so that's fine, that's it. But this was like, this hit home, and I was like, I can't listen to this is too, this hurts too much to know that this was a thing. So I imagine I'll, if you want, I'll forward you that episode if you want to check it out, because it was
I've consumed too much of this stuff, man. I'm not gonna follow up.
No, it's okay. That's perfect. Set boundaries, man.
Yeah, and that I found the boundary, and it is any more germ theory denialism than I need to. To round out this story, basically, this like the cult of germ theory denialism follows the Béchat was right, Pasteur was wrong. He was covered up. It was like Galileo, like really this guy's got it all figured out, and it stays going for the next couple of years, but really resurfaces again during the HIV pandemic. And so,
yes, that was a big thing for these people.
Yeah, you're familiar. Okay, so like the idea that HIV was not the cause of AIDS, which like
that's when I started losing it.
Yeah, every consensus is that HIV does cause AIDS these days. Like, get out of here. That's when it seemed like, okay, this is a agenda first, science second kind of platform, where it is, I don't like the lifestyle of the people who typically get AIDS, and so I'm going to blame it on their biology, right?
Sure. Yep.
And it's, these days it is people who don't want to get vaccines. And so they decide like, yeah, it's not, viruses actually don't cause disease. It's something else, So it's like, you can just say that you don't like the thing, man. You don't have to redo science to fit your perspective.
Yeah, but it's
everybody's the main character in their own movie.
So.
Yeah. And they want to convince everybody else that they're wrong. But yeah, there's a reason why Pasteur won and not Béchat, because he was writer.
He had the better finishing move.
Yeah.
Pasteur's pile driver. Everybody knows that.
It is funny. I remember like when the pandemic hit and there was a comment section, and for me, it was like, I didn't necessarily like the approach of the government, especially in the States. Like if you tell somebody from America to do something, what are they going to do? The opposite of what you told them to do. If you ask nicely, we might be more likely to do that. But the comment section, and everybody turned into like amateur microbiologists and virologists. And I was like, what in the hell is happening? Like,